Welcome to the London Luminaries, now 15 properties working together to celebrate our collective history. My name is Rachel Morrison and I volunteer for Marble Hill, but I'm also a trustee of the London Luminaries. I get the joy of introducing our fantastic chair for this evening. This is Angela Kidner, who is a super trustee of Pope's Grotto and also of the London Luminaries. Angela Kidner.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you, Rachel, and to you and everyone behind the scenes who makes these series possible. Chris, Robert, Ricky, the list is long. It's a pleasure, as always, to understudy Judith Hawley, who's away on holiday for once, and she's deserved it. Welcome to you all to this talk by the newest addition to the Luminaries fold, Syon House. We've grown from an original Twickenham-based group of 5, widening the boundaries to include Hounslow, Ealing and Fulham, and now Syon brings the number of properties to 15 and also introduces us to a new historical era. Most of our talks on previous series have been on 17th and 18th century properties and their owners. In this talk, we'll be learning about Syon House and Park in the medieval and Tudor periods. As with all our talks, tonight's will be recorded on YouTube, though without the discussion that follows. This growing collection of talks is available on our website as a resource to anyone, anywhere who wants to study it. This wonderfully named talk, Devotion, Lust and an Exploding King, is an advanced guard for the series of 6 that will start in the autumn on the theme of love and death. There will also be 4 more standalone lectures, one for each month from now on. All is revealed on our website. Go there. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce Howard Simmons, who is our speaker tonight. A man of many parts and illustrious careers, including directorships of cultural services at several London boroughs. Howard has been one of the professional heritage guides at Syon House for the past 10 years. Welcome, Howard, and over to you.
Well, thank you so much. And can I say how delighted we are at Syon to be joining the Luminaries and an opportunity to tell you about Syon and its early history. Many people will know of Syon from basically the 18th century and Robert Adams' wonderful interiors and Capability Brown's magnificent landscaping. But we are, as our chair said, going to look at the early history of Syon. And just for those of you who may not be familiar with the house, this is Syon House, built between 1547 and 1550, overlooking the Thames, which you can see in the background. And this is looking from the other direction towards the north, with the lakes put in by Capability Brown, but towards the old Roman road from London to Silchester and on to Bath. And you can see the expanse of the estate. The house is set in approximately 200 acres of land. And the archaeology of the period has actually shown a variety of occupations from the Stone Age, the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And most significantly, the excavation, quite a sizable Roman settlement, which was partly a fishing port on the Thames and partly a settlement on that Roman road between London and Bath. I suppose a sort of Roman equivalent of a motorway service station where people could break their journeys and get refreshments and so on and so forth. And just picking up on the theme of love and death, in the excavations, a number of burials were found there, most conventional Roman burials, but one a hurried burial where the body had been interred in a disturbed state and clearly it looked like the scene of some violence. So that's just to start off with the death dimension. So if we move on to the theme of devotion and picking up with Shakespeare, and as you can see here, the quote, I built 2 chantries where the solemn priests sing still for Richard's soul. Very much in Henry V, Shakespeare pitches this, that Henry wishes to make amends for his father's usurpation of the throne and effectively for murdering Richard. He didn't do it directly, he was held a prisoner and died, starved effectively to death. And in the play, it talks about Henry both distributing alms to 500 people, moving Richard's body to Westminster Abbey, and essentially creating the new houses, the two religious orders, one on the south bank of the Thames, one on the north bank of the Thames, in the settings of the new palace, the Sheen Palace. And you can see on this an actual depiction. Now, effectively, if you look at 1 and 2, 1 is the current site of Syon Abbey, and that shows the abbey within its perimeter walls, some 40 acres enclosed in that area. And 2 shows the original site. So Henry basically creates the two, the Carthusian foundation on the south bank, and he creates the Syon founding on the north bank. But 2, near Twickenham Bridge, or as it currently is the first siting for the abbey. Unfortunately, this area is prone to flooding, as indeed it still is, and also the religious orders there are taken with illness, a form of malaria, we believe today, and so they looked around for land that was free from flooding and healthier, and they, looking around, identified the island you can see, or the Ayot, which is currently where the Syon House is. And that is where they move to create the new building. And moving up, they see this as akin to mounting the holy mountain of Mount Zion, and hence Syon Abbey is formed. Now, if we move on, we can see a little bit about the excavations that have been undertaken. We talked a little bit about the early Roman excavations, but in fact, we've been working on archaeological work around the house since 1998. And this shows the excavations on the lawns leading down to the river. And in fact, it was Time Team that came in initially to do a program, and they were actually exploring the Jacobean Gardens at the time. That's when they discovered these enormous footings, these great walls, and that puzzled them. And they decided that in essence, what they were discovering were the remains of Syon Abbey, and that the house itself is actually constructed using the foundations of the abbey itself. So the width of the abbey is actually the width of the house is the width of the abbey, and that gives you a sense of the scale. This picture shows the current Duke, 12th Duke of Northumberland, with Phil Harding of Time Team, being explained. I must say, if you watch the program, and at the end we will give you a link to go back to look at the Time Team program, you'll see the rising excitement as they realize just what an extraordinary building they have discovered. So what did Syon Abbey look like? Now, essentially, this is Bridgettine. This is the founding house in Sweden of the order, the Bridgettine order of nuns. And as far as we are aware, this architecture was replicated in most of the religious houses across Europe. The order was very successful, founded in 1340 by Bridget. And from the remains of the buildings that are extant, as well as archaeology that's been done on other sites, this vernacular architecture was what was used. So if we look at a depiction of Syon Abbey, then this is essentially what we believe pretty much Syon would have looked like. It was a very large construction on the riverbanks and would have been very visible from the Thames. And indeed, I think that was part of the reason for pitching it here, very close to Sheen Palace and later Richmond Palace. The order itself did get a great deal of sponsorship and support from both royalty and the nobility and gentry, merchants, and so was a very wealthy order. The interesting thing about it, essentially, was that the order had both men and women in it, and essentially they didn't mix. This contemporary woodcut shows how the church was entered. The nuns would normally be to the north, the lay preachers and priests to the south, and they would enter the church at different levels, and therefore be kept separate, and the dormitories were separate. And if we move to the next slide, then you'll see that essentially this is the layout as found by the archaeology at Syon. There's the central church, B1, sisters' ranges there, and the brothers' ranges lower down. And to the left, we believe these are the ranges for visitors, for sponsors and patrons who came for solace there and to take part in theological debate with the Holy Orders. And the library, we believe, was the area here by the church. And I should say that a very large library, more than 3,000 volumes, was built up at Syon Abbey. In fact, it was very well known as a major centre for theological dispute and debate, and attracted wide attention as a sort of wellspring for Catholic theology. So who was Bridget, or Brigitta? Well, she was part of the Swedish nobility. She married, she had 8 children, and then effectively she discovered God in a major way, and she became one of the major visionary figures in the Christian church. Is celebrated today, obviously still in Sweden, but also across Europe. In fact, was recently made a patron of the European community in her role. To the left, you can see Bridget having one of her many visions. She had, in essence, more than 400. These were written down and were discussed and debated across Europe. Seen as a very interesting intellectual approach to the Christian religion at the time. In the center, you have one of the pilgrims' badges. And in fact, if you took a pilgrimage to Syon Abbey, then you could get indulgences and dispensations from the Pope, and you had proof of your pilgrimage from these badges. This particular badge, interestingly, is held at the Gunnersbury Park Museum, but was issued from the Abbey. And to the right, you have a picture of the nuns. Their costume, this hasn't changed much. So this is, you can see a period piece, but the actual costume is still worn today. And they have this rather splendid circlet or crown over their wimples and veils, with the 5 wounds of Christ. So the white garment with the 5 wounds, 2 in the hands, 2 in the feet, and 1 in the side. And that led rather irreverently, more recently, to them being referred to as the hot cross bun nuns. But it's I think, not necessarily a terribly polite way of referring to what was a very, very religious order, and were known not only for their piety, but also for their research. The interesting thing is, we come back to the split between the men and the women. Many of the men who came to work in the Abbey as priests were academics. So many at Syon actually came from Cambridge University, and it developed a very strong academic tradition for that level of debate. And in fact, that's led it into serious problems later on with Henry VIII and the dissolution, which I shall come to in a second or two. The critical thing is looking at the royal connections and seeing how this worked through. So the Abbey is originally found by Henry V, and some people have claimed that really what Henry was doing by making such a royal investment was trying to create a powerhouse of prayer for the Lancastrian dynasty. His younger sister, Philippa, had married Eric of Pomerania, who was king of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So quite a major figure in the Nordic area. And she was particularly taken with Bridgettine order, which is why Henry himself was fascinated by them. And later, when she died, was buried actually in Vadstena, the mother house that you saw a picture of earlier. And this stained glass window is above her tomb. Now, clearly, this was a Lancastrian foundation and Lancastrian investment. So what happens during the Wars of the Roses when the Yorkists effectively take the throne and you have Edward IV as king? Well, the answer is that they very cleverly move themselves to get him to rededicate the Abbey and therefore to get a significant Yorkist support. And so while the Yorkist regime is there, himself and Richard, there's continuing investment and support and patronage for the Abbey. And then, of course, Elizabeth of York, who marries Henry VII, ensures that there's a continuation into the Tudor era. So the Abbey has thrived very, very significantly. It's worth perhaps saying that there are some 800 religious houses across the country, and Syon Abbey was effectively the 10th wealthiest of those 800. holding lands from St Michael's Mount down in Cornwall, right the way up to Lincolnshire, and with a whole range of patrons who clustered to actually have their names recorded as supporting the Bridgettine Foundation. And just to say, there's much of the Abbey that remains, because as I mentioned, the house is actually built on the foundations of the old Abbey. And when they built it, they decided to not try and build new cellars or any of the underbuildings, but to simply use the undercroft of the Abbey as the cellars of the house. And this is the undercroft today at Syon House, which you can visit. And it has an archaeological exhibition and explains about the Bridgettine order and some of the artifacts that have been found here at Syon. And yes, there's a figure of a nun in the background wearing the costume that we referred to earlier. Yeah, so if you haven't been, I do recommend coming and looking at this in a little more detail. So that sets the background. So let's move on to the lust dimension. And again, a quote from Shakespeare. So love surfeits not, lust like a glutton dies. Love is all truth, lust full of forged lies. Very true, very Shakespeare. And essentially, this sort of sets out the very turbulent history that Syon now enters into. And perhaps we can start with someone at the center of all of this, which is Henry VIII, of course, and his 6 wives. Now, I think everyone knows about Henry and the Tudors because it's still part of the school curriculum. And so I think kids are, whether they like it or not, learning a lot about Henry and his 6 wives. Henry, of course, is quite a fascinating Renaissance prince, putting aside his domestic life and his marital difficulties. He is someone who is doing a great deal to modernize England. Essentially invests in the Navy, invests in the army, invests in technology. Locally, he creates gunpowder mills here at Hounslow Heath. And he himself is no slouch in terms of actual music, dance, and study. Don't forget that the Pope actually honored him with the title Defender of the Faith, Fid Def, in relation to his theological writings and support of the papacy. Somewhat ironic given what happened subsequently. But I want to focus here on 3 particular individuals. The first is Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine, a Spanish princess, who marries Henry's elder brother, Arthur, and comes to live in England as his bride, raised as a daughter of the Spanish king and queen, clearly to be a noble woman who studied extensively. She was extremely bright, spoke many languages, very informed, very acute mind. Sadly, Arthur dies, and Henry then marries her. And we tend to focus on the end of their relationship and the bitter struggle with Anne Boleyn and the divorce. People need to remember that they're married for 23 years. And in fact, for most of that time, they have a happy and very successful partnership. Henry, they're the golden couple of Europe in a sense. Henry is doing his warlike stuff in France and competing with basically the Emperor Maximilian and so on and so forth. But he leaves his queen to rule England, to manage, and she does, including a crisis when the Scots invade, which leads to the bloody Battle of Flodden and the victory over the Scots and the death of the Scottish king. And it's her as queen who is actually leading all of that. Now, sadly, she has 6 children, but only 1 survives. Most die very young, including their young son, their first child, after 2 months. And it's her daughter, Mary, who will effectively become the first Queen Regent of England as Mary I. But Catherine and Mary were regular visitors to Syon. They obviously spent time at Richmond Palace, just across the water. And since Syon was known as a theological centre, they would both come here, the child and the mother, to engage in debate with the nuns and their brothers. Moves us on to her nemesis to a degree, which is Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne, of course, Henry moves to her, both because he is obviously smitten with her, and I guess that's where some of the lust comes in, but also because he's desperate for a male heir, and Catherine's at the stage now when she's not able to provide that. And he's very hopeful that Anne will. Anne, again, coming from a humbler background, but a woman who has been brought up and educated in Europe at the courts in Austria and France, speaks again a number of languages and is extremely bright and able, and clearly fascinates Henry, essentially. And people look at the contrast between the two of them, but there's similarities too. They both marry Henry, they both bear children, mostly who die, and only one child survives them both, and they're both women, so Mary and Elizabeth, and they both become our first two Queen Regnants, Mary I and Elizabeth I. And both are passionate about their religion, but whereas Catherine is fully supportive of the Catholic Church, it's Anne who's looking for reform and the Protestant religion. And we move on to the fifth of Henry's queens, Catherine Howard, the young teenager. And this is where Henry, again, I think lust is the issue here. Henry is an old man now, effectively, and in ill health. And essentially, his eye is caught by the young teenager at court, and he marries her, besotted with her, only to discover that she has a somewhat colourful past history, and has had a number of sexual partners. And essentially, he then has her tried as a traitor. And he sends her, as part of imprisonment, here to Syon. And she is held in just 2 rooms within the old Abbey buildings for a period of time, 3 to 4 months, where he dangles in front of her the prospect that she might be forgiven. But in the end, he doesn't. And she is sent from here down to the Tower of London to be executed. So basically, at the age of 17, she is executed, and the theme of death strikes again. Now we move on to Cromwell. Cromwell, in fact, comes to Syon, and that's partly when he's doing his investigations of Elizabeth Barton, or the Holy Maid of Kent. Syon has supported her. She is clearly not popular with Henry VIII, since she has spoken up very strongly against Henry's divorce from Catherine and his marriage to Anne Boleyn. And it leads to her basically being tried and executed, and the only woman to have her head displayed on Tower Bridge, in fact. But that marks Syon as being an area of problems from Henry's and Cromwell's point of view. And subsequently, when the commissioners are appointed to look into the activities at the abbeys, Cromwell sends his agents in, and he's able to produce a report in which he talks about the lust and incontinence of the nuns who make free with the friars. I think somewhat colourful language for the time, and there's certainly no objective evidence to this effect whatsoever, but it's sufficient to lead to the dissolution of Syon as such. But before then, of course, we have the martyrdom of Richard Reynolds. Richard Reynolds, the father confessor at Syon, refuses to accept Henry's new status as head of the church and the act of supremacy, and holds out against it. He is taken and executed, in fact, hung, drawn, and quartered as a traitor. And you can see in this draft of a stained glass window, you can see the hanging, drawing, and quartering here in the background. And for those who don't know, you were hung but not allowed to die, taken down and effectively disemboweled. And if you're a man, castrated, and your bowels were then withdrawn and drawn out. So the hanging, the drawing, and then the quartering of the body chopped in 4 parts and displayed in different parts of the kingdom. And his head was displayed above the gateway here, the old gateway, which we still have, in fact, into the barn area, medieval barn that we still have at Syon. Now, things move on because at this stage, Henry dies. Many people think Henry is responsible for the destruction of the abbey at Syon. Not true. Henry dies, and more of that will come up later. And immediately there's concern because his young son, is only 9 years old, is clearly not in a position to rule the country and needs support. And the Council of State is created and the Privy Council to support that. And Edward Seymour, the young boy's uncle, is appointed Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector, so effectively the most powerful man in the country. He also determines he wants to build a new home for himself, thinks that this site on the River Thames, very close to Richmond Palace, is ideal. So he grants himself the land on which the abbey stands and then very carefully pulls down the abbey and essentially sells off a lot of the stone. We think some of that stone was reused for his own building techniques in central London, but builds the house in the latest Renaissance style on the foundations of the Abbey. Is a quick and cheap way of putting it up. So between 1547 and 1550, the house is constructed, and he then creates gardens in the latest Italianate style to go with it. And with that, the large walls, which you can see in the painting here. Now, its political enemies effectively think that he is well, his behavior is such that he draws an awful lot of enmity, and his political enemies bring 17 charges of treason against him, one of which is that he's fortifying Syon House with great cannons that can control the River Thames, as you can see here. Not true, but just one of the 17 charges. It leads to his basically being arrested and executed on Tower Hill, and his young king, Edward, essentially is at this stage writes in his diary, well, this morning was mine uncle put to death. Just simply a very cold statement like that. Now, Seymour is replaced by John Dudley, his political nemesis, who takes over as Lord Protector. And Dudley, a reformer of the Protestant religion, very keen to progress forward Protestant reforms and hopes to work closely with Edward in doing this. Basic problem is that Edward is then smitten with illness. Now, some historians have written that Edward is a sickly child from the word go. I think that's simply not true. Edward was effectively a fairly active and healthy child, but he contracted measles, was very ill with those. That seemed to compromise his immune system. And he then contracted tuberculosis and died a very horrible death as still a teenager. A crisis then arises because who takes the throne? And Mary, as Henry VIII's daughter and that of Catherine of Aragon, is the next successor in line. What Dudley has done is to work with Edward on his deathbed to create what he calls his device for the succession, which is to say that there should be a Protestant candidate for the throne, and that should be Lady Jane Grey, who is effectively the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and so has a claim to the throne, but clearly not the direct daughter of Henry VIII. And Lady Jane Grey is summoned to Syon House, where she is proclaimed queen in the long gallery at the house. This is exactly where it happened. This is the current long gallery in Syon House. She argues against this. She does not think this is a good idea, but essentially she accedes to her father-in-law's requests, and she then travels down the river by barge to the Tower of London, ready for the coronation. That doesn't take place because Mary appeals to the people, and essentially they rally to her. So despite being a Catholic, it is Mary who becomes queen after 9 days, and it is Jane who becomes a prisoner in the Tower. Now, Mary actually liked Jane, and it is unlikely that she would have harmed her. She's still only a teenager, only 17 years old, but Jane's father rises in rebellion again, and in this occasion, Mary realizes that as long as Jane is alive, she will be a threat to her, and essentially, therefore, Jane is executed. So another death in the bloody history that surrounds the time and surrounds Syon House as well. Mary, as queen, of course, is busy trying to recreate the Catholic religion in England. And interestingly, she's taken Syon back as a royal property, and she decides to give it to the Bridgettine nuns. So the Bridgettine nuns, who were forced out at the time of the dissolution, are invited back. And for the period of Mary's reign, Syon becomes known as a center for Catholic theology again, with major masses and teachings in the open air outside, attracting large crowds, several thousand people coming to some of them. So this is Mary's attempt to recreate the Catholic religion, doomed somewhat to failure, and she dies shortly afterwards, probably some form of stomach cancer, and her sister Elizabeth comes to the throne, or half-sister Elizabeth. Now Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, so you see the Catherine of Aragon and the Anne Boleyn connection here. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, is a Protestant, and she immediately kicks the nuns out of Syon, out again, takes the house back as a royal property, so it's now still a royal palace, And she's using this essentially not to live in, because she loves Richmond Palace. She visits it regularly. In fact, she will essentially die there later on. But she uses Zion for councils of state. And there's some 13 councils of state held at Zion over the years, including one major celebration when Francis Drake navigates the world. But it's essentially here that the proposals come about some of the colonial initiatives that will be taken, the creation of Virginia in the Americas, and she is linked to Zion in that way, essentially. While she is queen, she brings down the 9th Earl, Henry Percy, from Northumberland. Now, he has married, through marriage, through Deborah, he has a link to the house, and Queen Elizabeth is looking to make money. She wants to make a rental from Zion to offset the costs. And she's also quite keen to keep Henry close to her, because he's part of a traditional Catholic family. He's been raised as a Protestant, but she's still dubious about the Northumberland connection. And she thinks having him in London near her is a better idea than having him up in Northumberland, where he's got his economic, military and other powers. And so he is brought down to Zion and in 1593 and rents the house from Elizabeth at that stage. In the portrait, you can see him wearing the gown of Chancellor of Cambridge University. And he's known as the Wizard Earl because he was a polymath, really. He was interested in all sorts of things. So he's interested in alchemy, he's interested in sponsoring the arts. Extraordinary man. And his grouping of intellectuals, Walter Raleigh, who was a friend in connection, and Thomas Harriot, perhaps the greatest British scientist of the period, in terms of his as a mathematician, and interest in navigation. He himself had scouted the coastline of North America and drawn maps and things. He receives patronage from Henry, the 9th Earl, and in fact sets up an observatory and laboratory here at Zion. And it's from here that he does the first drawings of the moon and the circles around Jupiter and things like that. In fact, he pips Galileo to the post in doing this, but unfortunately doesn't claim credit for it. So Galileo gets the credit and he doesn't. But this grouping are known as the Circle, the School of the Night, and this intellectual circle group are essentially grouped here at Zion. I should just say, picking up on that connection with the Americas, that George Percy, his younger brother, becomes governor of Jamestown in Virginia, and is there during the starving time. And it's he who makes the connection with Pocahontas, who comes across in 1616, basically 1617, to promote Virginia colony with her husband. She's married back at Blantyre over there, John Rolfe, and she becomes quite a sensation, a real celebrity at the time. She stays 10 months at Zion, and during her time here, James I and his queen, Queen of Denmark, Anne of Denmark, come to visit her here, and she goes with them to the theatre in London, and it's all great stuff. So we then move on to James I, who basically regards the 9th Earl as a great friend and ally. He's known him from the time when he was up in Northumberland, and he's known him as someone who's helped him to come to the throne in a peaceful way. So James VI of Scotland, James I of England, and effectively he wants to show his appreciation. And so he gives the freehold of Syon House to the Percy family. And it's in 1603 that Zion becomes effectively the London home of the Percy family, as it still is today. There is, however, a sting in the tail here, because that's 1603. In 1605, on the 4th of November, the 9th Earl has his cousin Thomas Percy here for a meal, innocuous enough, but the 4th of November is the day before the 5th of November, and Thomas Percy is one of the key conspirators in the gunpowder plot to blow up the House of Parliament and to kill the king. This is discovered, and the explosion does not happen, and so that isn't an explosion, but it does lead to the Earl being imprisoned in the Tower of London for some 15 years and only being allowed out when he's paid a fine of £30,000, which is many millions of pounds in today's prices. That is moving on into, if you like, the Stuart age. So we'll finish with, from an explosion which didn't happen, which is gunpowder plot and explosion at the House of Parliament, to an exploding king. And this goes back to good old Henry VIII. So when Henry dies, his body is obviously put on show in state, Westminster, and the intention is to have him buried at Windsor. Now, he could have been taken down the river by barge, which would have been the speedy way for this to happen, but they decided on a major procession overland between London, Whitehall, and Windsor. And this clearly took more than one day, it took 2 days. So they planned for the body to rest overnight here in the Abbey Church, which was there at the time. And so this great procession, very similar, in fact, to the procession when our late Queen died, and we've seen these great ceremony that was made of it. Same sort of thing, moving along, some 4,800 people in the procession, people coming to watch it as it went by, the body being brought here to the Abbey and put in the church on the bier. Now they guarded, not the body in the coffin, but they guarded the effigy of Henry, which was on top of the coffin, because that had the crown and all the various rich clothes and other jewelry that Henry would normally have worn on that effigy. They left the coffin alone. During the course of the night, remember that Henry's been dead for some time. He's been put in, he's a very large man when he dies anyway. He's been put into a very heavy wooden coffin, which has been put inside a very heavy lead coffin. And the sheer weight of it breaks the bier on which it's resting, and it falls to the ground and cracks. Now, one story which the horrible histories school love is that, in fact, what happens is, because of the decomposition, when it falls, it explodes. And so you have the exploding king. And that's in our title, as you'll have guessed. What we think actually happened is it falls, it cracks open, and some of the contents leak out onto the floor. And the hunting dogs were there lick it up. And this fulfills the prophecy of Friar Peto, who'd said in 1535, in order to condemn Henry for his dissolution of the abbeys and for his attack on the Pope and creation of the English Church, he said to Henry, "The dogs will lick your blood as they did King Ahab." And this is a reference to the Old Testament. And sure enough, that's what actually happened. And we have the records of the workmen who came in the next day to seal up the coffin and let it process on its way, with most of Henry going on to be buried at Windsor, but some remaining here at Zion with the dogs. And there is Henry, just as a reminder of his iconic image, thanks to Holbein. And what I'd like to draw to a close, just to say, if you haven't visited Zion, please do come. You can see the interiors, the Robert Adam interiors, the neoclassical splendor on the left, and the magnificent gardens of the wonderful conservatory you can see in the background there. And just to point out that Zion is open from mid-March to the end of October. Conservatory and gardens are open all the time. The house only open 3 days a week. And on a Sunday, you have what we call free flow, where you can see the archaeology exhibition. So we do hope, if you haven't been, you will come and visit us.
Wow. Thank you, Howard. Can you hear me? This is a really wonderful talk, and we've so enjoyed it. Yes, please do, everybody, follow up with donations to Syon House, as well as visiting it. We may have emerged from the pandemic that gave rise to the Luminaries, but the current state of the economy is putting huge pressure on heritage properties who need every penny. Before we go to the questions which have been pouring in, a word about the next talk, which will be a new venture, a joint lecture by Turner's House and Pitshanger Manor and Gallery on Soane and Turner, architecture, art, friendship and fishing. Tickets are on sale, details are on the website.